and welcome to our second local author event, brought to you by New Writing South and Brighton and Hove Libraries. We're doing this interview remotely. It's January 2021, because once again we're in lockdown number 3. Hurrah, as a result of good old COVID. So of course we can't meet in the library on this occasion. Hopefully future events, chats will be back in libraries. My name's Jake. I work for Brighton and Hove Libraries, and I'm going to be talking to Craig Jordan Baker. Craig is a senior lecturer at the University of Brighton School of Humanities, and we're going to be talking, amongst other things, but mostly about Craig's debut novel, The Nacullians. Hopefully I pronounced that right. There it is. I've got mine too.
There we go, match.
Beautiful matching sets, and that's been published by Epoque Press. Hi, Craig.
Hi, Jake. How you doing?
I'm doing very well, thanks. And how are you?
Yes, not too bad. Work is ramping up, and it's a very different environment teaching online. But I think we've all got to adapt to these sort of times. So I'm doing fairly well, I'd like to think.
Good for you. I suppose we've had a little bit of practice at this now. So what I'd like to do is just start off with a few Craig facts, if that's okay, so people can get a little sense of who you are, or at least from the limited amount of stuff that I've got, and perhaps you could confirm or deny some of the stuff I'm about to claim.
Sounds juicy.
So I've got you're a member of Brighton and Hove Organic Gardening Group. You've made videos about foraging.
That's right, yep.
You're a doctor, I'm assuming, of writing, but maybe you're a medical doctor. I don't know.
I'm a doctor. I got my PhD in philosophy.
Ah, okay, a philosopher. Interesting. You're from Southampton originally.
That's right. Yep.
Yeah. And you're a vegan and eco warrior.
So I don't know about the latter. I certainly have a very largely vegan diet. Yeah.
I've got your favourite book down as Moby Dick.
One of my favourite books is, I think it's a hard thing to choose, and maybe an impossible thing to choose, but one of my favourite books for a lot of reasons is indeed Melville's Moby Dick.
Okay, so we kind of got half the facts right, it seems here.
Yeah.
That's all I've got on the fact front. So yeah, that by way of introduction. Niculians. Now, I've read it and I thoroughly enjoyed it. I found it was quite a page turner, which is interesting because it's not traditionally a story as such, in the way that other novels are. To give people a bit of background, it's a story of an Irish family in Southampton. The mother and father are Irish immigrants. Their children are born over here. And it's kind of a series of scenes from their life at different points in time. And then parallel to that, you've got a kind of exploration of different aspects of the city itself. Have you got anything to add to that overview there?
I think that's a really good overview. It could be called a family epic, but it's not long enough for an epic. I've taken you might call stories and elements and scenes from 3 generations of the same family, and hopefully through engaging with those scenes, the reader themselves starts to build up a picture and starts to fill in the gaps. So it becomes an epic, perhaps in the mind, but it's not an epic on the page.
Yeah, I hadn't thought of it in that way, but I think that's exactly right. There's so many different fragments of stories over such a wide time frame that you almost create an overarching narrative for yourself in terms of their lives unfolding, even though you're really just getting quite small snapshots of it.
Yeah, I think that's right. Yeah.
What I wanted to ask you, obviously you're from Southampton, the book's based in Southampton, is how much of it is biographical?
So it's very it sounds evasive to say, but I do think that a lot of people perhaps make the mistake, and writers included, of thinking that the fiction's made up. So in a sense, I'm saying this is fiction, but it's not made up. In a sense of just coming from the blue sky. I think writers subconsciously or consciously are taking ideas and elements of their own lives and the stories of others and building some kind of tapestry which ends up being a novel. So there are some, I suppose, striking resemblances. My family has an Irish background. I'm come from a working class background as well in some of the estates that are described in the book. So it's largely set in the east of Southampton, which is a very deprived part of Southampton and has some real issues still with poverty and other attendant problems. So yeah, it is partly it has certainly elements of my life, and I'm basing some things off experiences and reflections, but there's it's all got to be in service of the work itself. It's not me trying to bleed my heart out to talk about the things I might have suffered. It's much more about it's my life is only useful insofar as it contributes to hopefully an engaging and interesting piece of work.
Yeah, and I would certainly say is that there's a kind of a level of detail there. Which is why it made me think of it as being biographical. There's a sense of you having real knowledge of the place and of those situations as well. It's it felt very realistic in that sense. There's a sort of almost griminess to the reality there. Yeah, it felt kind of lived, I think.
That's really good to know, and I'm sure. In some ways, part of that is in my own experience, but part of that I think is research. So one of the things I did I researched a lot about bricks and bricklaying. Now, my family do come from a bricklaying family. Lots of bricklayers in my family, but I've never been I've never been a brickie, and I've never been a brickie's mate. And so I had to do a lot of research into different brick types, different bond types. And in my house, there are little posters of the different brick bonds, and I've now become quite interested in different kinds of brick bonds.
It's right. I think it's right at the start of the second chapter, and it says life is not a story. And when I first read that, I sort of reacted to it thinking, oh, hang on a second, life is a story. There's a beginning, there's a middle, there's an end. It is kind of a narrative. And I think as the book progressed, and we've kind of touched on this a bit already, kind of realized actually life isn't a narrative. It's kind of it is a collection of fragments of memories and scenes and so forth. So I kind of got turned around to your way of thinking there. So I think the book really reflects that kind of thing in humans, that we're a collection of scenes and memories which are usually fuzzy, inaccurate. You compare a memory with a sibling, for instance, and you come back to something completely different. So obviously this is a very intentional thing within the book. What kind of led you to this approach?
Well, I suppose partly due to my studies in philosophy. I mean, in ethics, there's a big question about how we consider ourselves as selves, and how we consider our lives. And some philosophers are narrativists who believe that actually we need to understand our lives as essentially dramatic narratives, and that explains why we read and engage in enjoying narrative, because actually it reflects our lives. And then on the other end, you have philosophers who say no, it's because we read so many books and watch so many films that we start thinking that our lives are narratives, and so it's chicken and egg kind of sort of situation. And the narrator actually kind of contradicts themselves quite a bit. I mean, there's a lot of contradictions in the narrator. The narrator at one point says that sandwiches aren't important and they're not symbolic, and then then a few chapters later there's a big section that discusses the symbolic importance of different kinds of sandwich on a building site. And so while the narrator makes an attempt to say that life isn't a story, that's kind of an attempt to say, look, some of these things are real. They're not mere stories. But then later on, there are hints that actually, this is a story, and don't take it for life. This is just a story, as a kind of trying to push it away. So the narrator's often engaged in slightly tricksy maneuvers, and I think. Ultimately, my own opinion is life is a narrative, but it's one one where the editorial pen is constantly suspended above it.
Yeah, I'd forgotten that scene on the building sites with the sandwiches. That was really funny. I mean, I've never worked on the building site, but I can totally imagine that being the case. One thing I'd like to touch on here, Craig. So we've got these kind of scenes throughout the book, and you're kind of jumping between different eras, seemingly randomly, but interlaced throughout that is I think it's a series of 4 chapters about the actual place itself, where you're looking at and I don't think you mentioned that it's Southampton by name at any point, but you kind of work it out from the place names and so forth. It seems like that's a device to kind of give people a sense of the space they're in, and also the kind of significance of space and place, and how that colours or impacts your life.
Yeah, I think that's really well put. I mean, one of my academic interests is in the literary representation of landscape and space, and so it's something I've got, I've got an abiding interest in. And I'm a walker, I'm a forager. I'm interested in space and how it affects us. And I think in those interludes we get to know that the city, as you say, but also I hope a reader gets a sense that the family themselves don't know that this city is influencing them, that the way it was built up, the post-war housing boom, the estates that were made on the east side of the city, and the kind of atmosphere of that, all of these things are influencing them, perhaps silently. And I sometimes describe landscape as a kind of silent parent, and we often talk about the inheritance that we get from our parents, be it financial, genetic, or social. We maybe get our accents from them, or loads of things. But I think the places where we're from, because we are born into them, sometimes they can be invisible to us to some extent. And the interludes are an attempt to just lift up and give the reader an overview, and give them a sense of the many things that a city is, and the many ways that they can influence individuals.
You're from Southampton. Now, my colleague Julie, who set this conversation up, is from Portsmouth.
She's a skate. I know, she's a skate.
She did want me to ask this question, so I'm going to pop it in now as we're talking about place. She wanted me to ask you about the rivalry between Portsmouth and Southampton. What's that all about?
Well, the important thing is that no one knows what it's all about. All we know is that we hate one another. And when I was growing up, I obviously I was aware of the antipathy towards Portsmouth that was obviously reciprocal. And I think somewhere in the novel the narrator says, people from this city hate people from Portsmouth because knowing who you are can just about tell you who you are, or it's an attempt to try and tell you who you are by defining yourself as not from Portsmouth. And I rib Portsmouth a bit, or the narrator ribs Portsmouth a bit, but also I think there's a wry awareness of that this is really rather thin and superficial, kind of rivalry that nevertheless helps to define a sense of place and identity for quite a few people.
And one thing I wanted to touch on, Craig, which I thought was an important aspect of the book, is it's the story or stories of a working class family. Now, class is something, for me, it seems to be a little bit absent from dialogue at the moment. And I was just wondering if that was part of your kind of drive in writing the book, in having those stories told, or just sort of putting that back into the public consciousness in some way, shape or form.
I think it's certainly, I would agree that it is a concern of mine that we talk a lot about privilege, and that's really important. And we talk about identity politics, and our identities are really important. But class is one of the principal ways in which I think we should be thinking about privilege. So from that perspective, I absolutely agree. And yeah, I guess perhaps we got bored of it talking about it. I don't know, and we want to have a we want to, and there are new ways in which people are identifying, and so those have maybe yet to be fully theorized and talked about enough, where maybe we've been talking about class since 1850 and up to 1989, and then and there might be a certain tiredness with it, but also I think maybe, and I think this is a genuine consideration, that I think for some people probably younger, the way in which their experience, I think, maybe is better explained by certain aspects of how they identify or where they see themselves and their contexts. I still think, though, class is, if not the ultimate arbiter and one and all arbiter of where we go and what we do. I think that probably, if you just looked at the average income of the people in the postcode in which you were born, that's I think the best. I think it is still the best predictor of the average income you will have when you're an adult. Crude as that individual predictor might be, it nevertheless suggests that that we still need to be talking about wealth and opportunity for and the privilege that comes through having wealth and opportunity, and that really is based on how we are organized our society in layers, or in class layers still. So yeah, I think it's de-emphasized. I don't know if people are forgetting it, but I think it's de-emphasized because there are new experiences that people are having and that they want to talk about. But I still think a lot of the issues are still can be talked about through the lens of class. And so there is something in the book which ultimately, and this is something very strongly I felt when I was growing up, was that tomorrow was going to be pretty much like today, and not much was likely to change, and if it was going to be almost imperceptible, change, ultimately, and you shouldn't really expect things to get better. That's pie-eyed and slightly naive and slightly romantic, and there is a tone in the book, I think, which I'm attempting to try and capture that, rather than being like, working class kid made good, or working class kid understands the benefits of human emancipation and love, etc.
Yeah, and I totally got that from the book as well. It's very matter of fact, just kind of viewing things as they are without taking a stance on it. And I think that's one of the things that I enjoyed. It's a mixture of real kind of poignancy and tragedy, and at the same time offset with a lot of dark humor, absurdity. There's a lot to laugh about there. It's sort of, there's a kind of a warmth there, and a non-judgmental stance of just kind of presenting it as it is, and you can just kind of enjoy it on that level. It's nice. There's no sort of crusading sort of element there. It's it's just kind of presenting lives as you see.
Yeah, I would say that I would say that it isn't a soapbox novel, and I would never, and I'm not particularly keen on work that tries to overwhelmingly push a monological perspective on an issue. I think the job of the writer is to set up an imaginative landscape with which readers can engage and fill in the gaps, as we'd already talked about, but also have enough information to make their own judgments about how they feel about this character. And I think when the reader does that kind of intellectual work, we're trusting the reader, and I think it's a less potentially patronizing way of engaging with them, but we're also encouraging people to think. And I think one of the great things, and one of the reasons why I teach literature, is because I think literature has a brilliant power to allow us and help us to think. And if we just told what to think, then that's not helping us at all. Okay. It's just
I'd like to talk a little bit about libraries.
Oh yes.
Of course, I'm here in my capacity as a library member of staff and representing libraries in Brighton and Hove and elsewhere. So I was interested to find out, Craig, what sort of influence or impact libraries have had on your life, both in the past and perhaps the present as well?
Well, there are so many times in my life where I can kind of see myself in a library of one sort or another. Um, I was really lucky as a working class kid that my mum was really keen on, on me, and my sister, reading. She'd take us down to the very, very small community library on the estate, which was next to a Chinese takeaway actually. So it was a very small space, and I remember going in there, and I started to read fantasy and choose your own adventure novels, which I found incredibly exciting. I remember mobile libraries coming in and around this estate, and they'd stop off and you would hop on them for a quarter of an hour and take a book out. There was always something novel about books themselves, I suppose. By which I mean that there were ways of touching contexts that were outside of your own. I mean, fantasy is an obvious example. And I think in that way, I think for me, growing up where I did, they were important. I also remember Southampton, in the centre of town, has a great library, and I remember being rather intimidated and awed by it. You walk into it and then it sort of seems to sink down, and there are avenues and avenues of books which you can look out. When you enter the library, you look down upon it. And I remember going in there, and I wanted to learn about sort of tattooing and the history of tattooing when I was about 17. And there was I was surprised to find, yes, there was a book on that, and there was a really informative book about the different kind of cultural significance of tattoos. And then, in my PhD and MA, I spent a lot of time in Sussex Library, hauled up in a corner, looking out the window, and then going back to my book. And of course, the Jubilee Library in Brighton is really special for me, because I think it's a library that is not, of course, it's about books, but it's embracing this newer idea, which is that they're community spaces. They're not just places where you go and get a book and you come out. They provide a number of functions. And I think that's entirely appropriate, especially where perhaps we're lacking community spaces, or there's a pressure on community spaces. And so, the Jubilee Library is a real, has been very useful for me. And I would often go in and sit in the papers section and make notes about a story or an essay, or what I was writing, and spend a couple of hours there in the kind of relative quiet.
Yeah, I think you've hit on one of the aspects of libraries that I really love, and it's become more apparent to me since COVID struck, is when we were able to open after the first lockdown. We had a very limited service we could offer, so people could basically come in, a limited number of people, borrow a book, leave, or use a computer, and that was kind of it. And it just felt like the heart of the library had kind of been ripped out, because people weren't able to just come in, hang out, sit down, browse a book, sip a coffee, read the paper, all that kind of stuff. Before I wrap up, I just wondered if there was anything else you wanted to add, if there's anything we missed, or you wanted to say. Now's a good time.
No, it's been a lovely conversation. I just also want to thank Brighton and Hove Libraries for doing this, and also to New Writing South as well. I mean, both great institutions in their own ways, and finding new and innovative ways to still do what libraries do in the most difficult of circumstances is brilliant. So well done to all of you and your team.
Oh, thank you so much. I mean, yeah, we're still plugging away. We've still got a few things going on. We've got all our online services, we're still doing the home delivery service, so we're still hanging in there. Thank you very much for agreeing to do this. It has been a lot of fun, and I feel like I've got a deeper perspective on the book now. I really do recommend it to anybody watching this. It is a great book. For a debut, I think you've done yourself proud there. Hopefully we'll have some more author interviews in the future, either online like this, hopefully back in libraries at some point as well. So maybe we'll get you back in again at some point.
Love to. The second one's in progress, so.
And of course, got to plug the book. Here it is.
Absolutely. Yeah, the Niculians.
We'll be able to borrow it from a library.
Absolutely.
And you can buy it from bookshop or online.
Brilliant.
So thanks again, Craig. Stay safe and good luck with whatever writing comes after this. I'm sure you've got more in the pipeline.
Yeah, thanks, Jake. That's great.